You know what's strange about the Porsche 911? The man who created the company that built it never actually wanted to make sports cars. Ferdinand Porsche spent his entire career designing cars for other people, revolutionizing the industry with ideas so radical that most of them were buried, forgotten, or credited to someone else. Here's the part that'll blow your mind. Before there was a single car wearing the Porsche name, Ferdinand Porsche had already invented the hybrid electric car, designed the world's first people's car, created the most dominant race cars in motorsport history, and pioneered technologies that every modern vehicle uses today. And almost nobody knows about any of it. Because Ferdinand Porsche was a genius who worked in the shadows, building other people's dreams while his own ideas were either stolen, suppressed, or so far ahead of their time that the world wasn't ready for them. Let's start with something that sounds impossible. In 1900, 23-year-old Ferdinand Porsche built an electric car that could drive over 40 miles on the single charge, hit speeds of 37 miles per hour, and had regenerative braking that recovered energy when slowing down. You read that right. 1900. Regenerative braking, electric drivetrain. The same technology Tesla would market as revolutionary. 108 years later, Ferdinand Porsche had already figured out before most people had even seen an automobile. It gets better. Porsche didn't stop at just electric. He took that same design and added a small gasoline engine that could charge the batteries while driving, creating the world's first series hybrid vehicle. The Lohner-Porsche Mixte could travel over 200 miles, switch between electric-only and hybrid modes, and had individual wheel motors. Individual wheel motors in 1900, the same concept that companies like Rivian are using today to enable tank turns and precise torque vectoring. Porsche pioneered 124 years ago, but here's where the story gets dark. Nobody cared. The car was too expensive, too complex, too far ahead of what people understood. Investors wanted simple, proven technology. So Porsche's hybrid electric masterpiece was dismissed as an interesting experiment, and the world spent the next century perfecting internal combustion engines instead. Imagine if they'd listened. Imagine if Porsche's 1900 hybrid had been taken seriously. We might have skipped the entire century of pure gasoline dominance. Climate change might look completely different, but innovation doesn't care about timing. It only cares about whether anyone's willing to bet on it. So young Ferdinand, bitter and frustrated, abandoned electric vehicles entirely and went to work for Austro-Daimler, where he spent the next 2 decades designing some of the most advanced internal combustion engines in the world. If they wanted gas engines, he'd give them the best gas engines ever built. And he did. By 1910, Porsche had become technical director of Austro-Daimler and was designing aircraft engines, race cars, and luxury vehicles that were winning everything. His designs were so advanced that competitors spent years trying to figure out how he was achieving performance they couldn't match. But here's what nobody understood about Porsche. He didn't care about winning races or building luxury cars. He cared about solving problems through engineering, and the problem that obsessed him was this. Why were cars so complicated, so expensive, so unreliable that only rich people could own them? This obsession would eventually lead to the Volkswagen Beetle, but that's not the forgotten story. The forgotten story is what happened in between, the 2 decades of brilliant designs that Porsche created for other companies, ideas that shaped the entire automotive industry, but were never credited to him. In 1923, Porsche designed the Sascha sports car for Austro-Daimler. It was tiny, lightweight, with an overhead cam engine that could rev to 5,000 revolutions per minute, unheard of at the time. The car won its class at the Targa Florio race in Sicily, beating machines with twice the engine size. The design philosophy behind the Sascha, lightweight beats raw power, handling matters more than straight-line speed, sophisticated engineering can overcome displacement disadvantages, became the foundation of every sports car Porsche would later build. But in 1923, it was just a small Austro-Daimler. Then Porsche moved to Mercedes-Benz in 1923 and spent 5 years creating some of the most iconic machines in automotive history. The supercharged Mercedes S, SS, SSK, and SSKL models, all Ferdinand Porsche designs. Those monsters with 300 horsepower dominating European motorsport through the 1920s? Porsche's work? But here's the twist. Porsche hated those cars. He thought they were excessive, wasteful, too powerful for their own good. He'd been forced to build them because that's what wealthy customers wanted, what racing demanded. But his heart was never in it. What Porsche actually wanted to build was the exact opposite. A small, efficient, affordable car that ordinary people could own and maintain. A car so simple and reliable that it could survive German winters and bad roads, and owners who knew nothing about mechanics. His bosses at Mercedes thought he was insane. Why would the man designing 300 horsepower race cars want to build cheap economy vehicles? It made no sense. So they rejected every proposal, every sketch, every argument Porsche made for building a people's car. Frustrated beyond measure, Porsche left Mercedes in 1928 and started his own consulting firm in Stuttgart. Finally, at age 53, he could design whatever he wanted for whoever was willing to pay for his expertise. And the designs that poured out of that office over the next 15 years would change automotive history. But here's what makes Porsche's consulting work so fascinating. He never turned down a project. Motorcycle companies, aircraft manufacturers, tractor builders, race teams, if they had an engineering problem, Porsche would solve it. And each solution advanced the industry in ways nobody recognized at the time. In 1931, Porsche designed a motorcycle for Zundap that used a revolutionary 5-cylinder radial engine. The project was cancelled before production, but the engine design principles influenced aircraft engines for decades. Another forgotten innovation, dismissed and buried. Then, in 1932, Porsche pitched a crazy idea to NSU, a small rear-engined car with a 4-cylinder boxer engine, independent suspension, and streamlined aerodynamics. NSU built 3 prototypes, tested them, loved them, and then abandoned the project for financial reasons. Those NSU prototypes contained every single element that would later define the Volkswagen Beetle and the Porsche 356, rear-engine layout, air-cooled boxer motor, backbone chassis, all of it. But in 1932, they were just experimental NSU vehicles that nobody remembers. Are you starting to see the pattern? Ferdinand Porsche kept inventing the future, and the world kept saying, not yet. Every major innovation that would later make him famous was already designed, tested, and rejected before most people had heard his name. Then, in 1934, something happened that would finally give Porsche the chance to build his people's car. Adolf Hitler became interested in the idea. And this is where the story gets complicated, uncomfortable, and impossible to separate from the darkest chapter in human history. Hitler wanted every German family to own a car. It was partly about mobility, partly about propaganda, partly about preparing infrastructure for military vehicles. And Ferdinand Porsche, who'd been dreaming of a people's car for decades, finally had someone willing to fund it. The collaboration between Porsche and the Nazi regime is one of those historical facts that can't be sanitized or explained away. Porsche took Nazi money, worked on Nazi projects, benefited from Nazi contracts. He wasn't forced. He chose to work with them because they were the only ones willing to fund his vision. The Volkswagen Beetle that emerged from this collaboration is probably the most successful car design in history, over 21 million units produced, spanning 7 decades, sold in every country on Earth. It's also a design created under one of history's most evil regimes. But here's what's rarely discussed. While designing the Beetle, Porsche was simultaneously working on something else, something even more revolutionary that the Nazis cared about much more than people's cars. Race cars. In 1933, Hitler had announced that the German government would fund Grand Prix racing to demonstrate Aryan superiority. 2 companies got the contracts, Mercedes-Benz and a new company called Auto Union. And guess who was hired to design Auto Union's race cars? Ferdinand Porsche. The Auto Union Type A, B, C, and D Grand Prix cars that Porsche designed between 1934 and 1939 were so radically advanced that they completely redefined what a race car could be. and they introduced technologies that wouldn't become mainstream for another 50 years. First, Porsche put the engine behind the driver, in the middle of the car. Every Grand Prix car before this had a front-mounted engine. Porsche looked at the physics and realized that mid-engine layout would give better weight distribution, better handling, better everything. The problem? Mid-engine cars were incredibly difficult to drive. The weight distribution made them unpredictable, twitchy, prone to spinning out if the driver made even slight mistakes. Professional racers were terrified of them. But Porsche had done the math. If you could master the handling, you'd be unbeatable. He was right. Once drivers learned to handle them, the Auto Union cars dominated European racing. They won Grand Prix after Grand Prix, set speed records that stood for decades, and forced every other manufacturer to abandon front-engine race car designs. Today, every Formula One car, every Le Mans prototype, every serious race car uses mid-engine layout. It's so obviously correct that nobody questions it. But in 1934, it was Ferdinand Porsche gambling his reputation on calculations that everyone else thought were wrong. The Auto Union cars also pioneered independent suspension on all four wheels, something Porsche had been obsessed with since his early designs. Before this, most race cars used solid axles, which were simple and durable, but limited how well the car could handle rough surfaces at speed. Porsche designed a complex torsion bar suspension system that allowed each wheel to move independently, keeping all four tires in contact with the road, even over bumps. It was mechanically complicated, expensive to build, and difficult to maintain. It was also massively superior. And here's the kicker. That same torsion bar suspension design that Porsche pioneered in 1934 Auto Union race cars. He used virtually the same system in the Volkswagen Beetle, and it worked so well that VW used it until they finally discontinued the Beetle in 2003. 69 years of production using a suspension design from 1934. That's not just good engineering, that's understanding fundamental principles so deeply that your solutions remain valid for 7 decades of technological advancement. But Porsche's Auto Union innovations went further. He designed streamlined bodies using wind tunnel testing, something almost nobody was doing in the 1930S. He pioneered using lightweight alloys and advanced metallurgy to reduce weight without sacrificing strength. He designed massive supercharged V12 and V16 engines that produced over 500 horsepower. These cars were absurdly powerful, wickedly fast, and absolutely terrifying to drive. Drivers called them the Widowmakers because so many racers died trying to control them. And then World War II started, and everything stopped. The Auto Union race cars were hidden away. The Volkswagen factory that was supposed to build people's cars was converted to military production. And Ferdinand Porsche was pulled into designing military vehicles, tanks, and weapons. This is the part of Porsche's story that his company doesn't talk about much. He designed the Tiger tank for the Nazis. He worked on military vehicles throughout the war. He wasn't just building cars, he was building weapons for genocide. After Germany lost, Porsche was arrested by French authorities and spent nearly 2 years in prison. His consulting firm was seized. His designs were confiscated. At age 70, Ferdinand Porsche looked like his career was over, destroyed by his collaboration with evil. But his son Ferry Porsche and his chief engineer Karl Raab had smuggled out the design drawings. And while Ferdinand was in prison, they started building a car in a tiny workshop in Gulund, Austria, a car based on all of Ferdinand's rejected innovations from the previous 40 years. The Porsche 356, the company's first production car, emerged in 1948 from that Austrian workshop, and when you look at it, you can see every one of Ferdinand's forgotten designs. The NSU prototype's rear-engine layout, the Sasha's lightweight philosophy, the Auto Union's suspension technology, even elements from the 1900 Lohner-Porsche's wheel design. It was like Ferdinand Porsche had been preparing for this moment his entire life, creating a library of innovations that nobody appreciated until Ferry assembled them, all into one brilliant, coherent package. Every rejection, every forgotten prototype, every buried design, it all came together. But there's one more forgotten Porsche design that almost nobody knows about, and it might be the most important of all. In 1947, while Ferdinand was still in prison, an Italian racing team called Cisitalia commissioned him to design a Grand Prix car. Cisitalia paid Porsche's bail, got him released from prison, and gave him complete freedom to design whatever he wanted. And what he designed was so advanced, so far ahead of its time, that when the Cisitalia Type 360 was finally revealed, racing experts couldn't believe it was real. Four-wheel drive, mid-engine layout, flat 12-cylinder boxer engine, space-frame chassis, fully independent suspension. The Cisitalia had technologies that wouldn't appear in actual Formula One cars for another 20 to 30 years. It was a race car from 1975, designed in 1947. But Cisitalia ran out of money before the car could race. Only one prototype was built, and it never turned a wheel in competition. Another revolutionary Porsche design, too advanced for its time, built but never used. It's now in the Porsche Museum, a monument to what could have been. Ferdinand Porsche died in 1951, 3 years after his son's first 356 rolled out of that Austrian workshop. He never saw the company that bears his name become famous. He never saw the 911 become an icon. He never knew that his forgotten designs would eventually be recognized as foundational to modern automotive engineering. But here's the thing about Ferdinand Porsche's legacy. It's not really in the cars that wear his name. It's in every car you see on the road. Mid-engine race cars? Porsche pioneered that. Independent suspension? Porsche made it work. Affordable people's cars with sophisticated engineering? Porsche designed the template. Even hybrid electric vehicles. The technology everyone treats as modern innovation goes back to Ferdinand Porsche in 1900, trying to solve problems that the world wasn't ready to admit existed yet. Then this is what makes his story so fascinating and so frustrating. Ferdinand Porsche was right about almost everything. His ideas were brilliant, his engineering was sound, his vision was clear. But he was always too early, always working for someone else, always seeing his innovations buried or credited to others. The Lohner-Porsche hybrid electric car? Forgotten for a century while we built millions of pure gas cars. The NSU rear-engine prototypes? Abandoned and forgotten until the Beetle proved the concept. The Auto Union mid-engine race cars? Revolutionary but dismissed as too difficult until everyone finally admitted Porsche was right. Every major innovation that defines modern cars, from suspension to engine placement to hybrid drivetrains, Ferdinand Porsche either invented or perfected decades before anyone else. And most of his work was forgotten, suppressed, or stolen. Think about what that means. The single most influential automotive engineer in history spent most of his career watching other people take credit for his ideas or reject them as impractical. The man who designed the world's most successful car, the template for every modern race car, and hybrid technology, a century ahead of its time, died relatively unknown. It wasn't until the 1960s and 70s, long after his death, that people started going back through the archives and realizing, wait, Ferdinand Porsche designed that, and that, and that too. The forgotten prototypes, the cancelled projects, the buried innovations, they were all his. And here's what's wild. We're still discovering Porsche innovations that were lost to history. In 2019, researchers found design drawings for an all-wheel drive sports car, Ferdinand Porsche, sketched in 1932, 15 years before the Cisitalia, 35 years before the Porsche 959 became the first production AWD sports car. The idea wasn't new to Porsche in 1947. He'd been thinking about it for at least 15 years, probably longer. But nobody was interested, nobody would fund it, nobody believed all-wheel drive belonged in a sports car, so the drawings sat in archives, forgotten. This pattern repeats throughout Porsche's career. Brilliant idea, way too early, rejected or abandoned, then rediscovered decades later when the world finally caught up. It's like he was operating on a different timeline than everyone else, seeing futures that wouldn't exist for generations. But there's something else in Porsche's forgotten designs that's even more interesting than the technology, the philosophy. Because when you study all his work, from 1900 to 1950, you see consistent principles that transcend specific solutions. Porsche believed that simplicity was sophistication, not simple as in crude, but simple as in solving complex problems with elegant solutions that eliminated unnecessary components. Every part had to justify its existence, or it shouldn't be there. This is why the Volkswagen Beetle used an air-cooled engine when everyone else was using water cooling. Water cooling required radiators, hoses, pumps, coolant, all things that could fail, leak, freeze, or break. Air cooling just needed a fan and some ducting. More elegant, more reliable, simpler. Was it the best technical solution? No. Air cooling had real compromises. It was louder, harder to keep at optimal temperature, less efficient. But it was the most elegant solution for a car designed to be maintained by farmers and factory workers who'd never seen an automobile before. This same philosophy appears in the Union race cars. While competitors were building increasingly complex engines with exotic valve trains and intricate supercharging systems, Porsche designed massive, simple V16s that made power through displacement and forced induction, not through mechanical complexity. The engines were brute force solutions, but they were reliable brute force. While other cars were breaking down from mechanical failures, the auto unions just kept running. Elegance through simplicity, even in a 500 horsepower race engine. The second principle that runs through all of Porsche's work: weight is the enemy of everything. Light weight improves acceleration, braking, handling, fuel economy, reliability, literally every performance metric. Adding weight to solve problems is lazy engineering. This obsession started with the Sasha in 1923 and never left. The Beetle was designed to be as light as possible while still being safe and durable. The 356 was built with aluminum body panels to save every ounce. Even those massive Auto Union race cars used lightweight alloys wherever possible. Today, every sports car manufacturer talks about weight reduction like it's a new philosophy. But Ferdinand Porsche was drilling this into his engineers in the 1920S. The Porsche 356 weighed 1,350 pounds, less than half what a modern Porsche 911 weighs, and it was designed 75 years ago. The third principle: distribute weight perfectly, and you can do things that seem impossible. This is why Porsche put engines in the back, why he designed mid-engine race cars, why he obsessed over where every component sat in the chassis. Most engineers looked at weight as a total number. This car weighs 3,000 pounds. That one weighs 3,500 pounds. Porsche looked at weight distribution as a geometry problem. Where is the mass located relative to the wheels? What happens to the center of gravity during quartering, braking, acceleration? This is why the Porsche 911 still uses a rear-engine layout that every engineering textbook says is wrong. Ferdinand Porsche proved in the 1930s that if you get the weight distribution right, if you design the suspension to work with the physics instead of fighting them, you can make a rear-engine car handle better than a front-engine one. Everyone said it was impossible. Physics professors explained why it couldn't work, and then Porsche built cars that did exactly what the textbook said was impossible, because he understood the underlying principles better than the people writing the textbooks. But here's what's really fascinating about Porsche's forgotten designs. They reveal a man who was willing to be spectacularly wrong in pursuit of being revolutionary. Not every innovation worked. Not every radical idea succeeded. And Porsche didn't care. In 1939, he designed a Type 114 racing car for Berlin-Rome road races that never happened because of the war. The car had a 1.5-liter V10 engine producing 550 horsepower, a 1.5-liter V10 making 550 horsepower in 1939. The engine was insane. It would rev to 10,000 revolutions per minute, far beyond what anyone thought was safe. The mechanical stresses should have torn it apart. Most engineers at Mercedes and Auto Union thought Porsche had finally lost his mind. The Type 114 was built, but the war started before it could race. When the prototype was rediscovered after the war, experts examined it and realized the engine design was fundamentally sound. It probably would have worked. Porsche wasn't crazy. He was just 30 years ahead of high RPM engine technology. This willingness to attempt things that seemed impossible, to design cars and engines that experts said couldn't work, became part of the DNA of every company Porsche influenced, and he influenced all of them. When Porsche left Daimler, his assistant Ferdinand Porsche stayed behind and eventually ended up at Volkswagen, then Audi. Porsche became CEO of Volkswagen Group, and forced through projects everyone said were impossible. The Bugatti Veyron, the Audi R8, the VW Phaeton luxury sedan. Porsche learned from his grandfather that impossible just means nobody's tried hard enough yet. That willingness to attempt the impossible came directly from watching Ferdinand Porsche design race cars that shouldn't work and people's cars that couldn't be profitable. At Mercedes-Benz, engineers who worked with Porsche in the 1920s carried his lessons forward. The 300 SL gull-wing space-frame chassis, that's evolved from Porsche's lightweight construction principles. The fuel injection system, advanced development of ideas Porsche had sketched. Even BMW, which competed against Porsche's designs, learned from them. The BMW 328 sports car from 1936, one of the most celebrated pre-war BMWs, used independent front suspension and lightweight construction principles that were direct responses to what Porsche had proven worked. German automotive engineering after 1945 was built on foundations Ferdinand Porsche laid, often without anyone realizing it. The obsession with precision, the focus on weight reduction, the willingness to try radical solutions, it all traces back to a man who spent 50 years designing other people's cars. But there's one forgotten Porsche innovation that might be the most relevant to where the automotive industry is heading right now, his understanding that you don't need massive power if you have efficiency and intelligence. The Lohner-Porsche from 1900 didn't try to match gasoline engines on raw power. Instead, it used electric motors' instant torque and smooth power delivery as advantages. The hybrid version didn't try to make the gas engine power the wheels directly. It just charged the batteries, optimizing each system for what it did best. This is exactly how modern hybrid systems work. The Porsche 918 Spyder, one of the most advanced hypercars ever built, uses the same basic philosophy Ferdinand Porsche designed in 1900: electric motors for instant response, gas engine optimized for efficiency, and charging. Between 1900 and 2013, the automotive industry spent 113 years proving that Ferdinand Porsche's original hybrid concept was correct. We just took a century-long detour through pure internal combustion before admitting he was right from the beginning. And this brings us to the most uncomfortable question about Porsche's legacy. How much did we lose because nobody listened? How much further along would automotive technology be if his 1900 hybrid had been taken seriously? If the NSU rear-engine prototypes had gone into production in 1933 instead of being cancelled? If the Cisitalia four-wheel drive race car had actually raced? If any of his radical innovations had been developed instead of buried? We can't know, but we do know that every time someone finally tried one of Porsche's impossible ideas decades later, it worked. The mid-engine race car layout dominated. The rear-engine sports car layout created the 911. The hybrid electric drivetrain is revolutionizing the industry. Ferdinand Porsche wasn't wrong. The world just wasn't ready. And that's the tragedy. Not that he failed, but that he succeeded and nobody recognized it until decades after his death. There's a design sketch in the Porsche Museum archives that perfectly captures this tragedy. It's from 1931, drawn by Ferdinand Porsche himself. It shows a small, streamlined two-seat sports car with a rear-mounted flat-six engine. 23 years before the first Porsche 356, 32 years before the 911, Ferdinand Porsche had already drawn what would become the most iconic sports car shape in history. But nobody would fund it. Nobody believed in it. Nobody thought it was worth building. So the sketch sat in a drawer for 2 decades, while Porsche designed race cars and military vehicles and people's cars for other companies. And then his son Ferry found those drawings after the war and said, "Let's finally build this." The 356 that emerged in 1948 wasn't a new idea. It was Ferdinand's old idea, finally given a chance. And it proved what Ferdinand had known since 1931. A small, lightweight, rear-engine sports car with a flat engine could be brilliant. But imagine if that car had been built in 1931 instead of 1948. Imagine if Porsche, the company, had existed 17 years earlier. Imagine how different automotive history would look if Ferdinand Porsche's timeline had matched the world's timeline. This is what haunts every study of Porsche's forgotten designs. They're time capsules from a future that should have happened sooner. Opening the archives and finding sketches from 1932 that show ideas from the 1960s, designs from 1937 that wouldn't make sense until the 1970s. It's like Ferdinand Porsche was living in the future and sending back blueprints, but they kept arriving before anyone knew what to do with them, and by the time people figured it out, they've forgotten where the ideas came from. Today, when Porsche engineers design a new 911, they're still working within frameworks Ferdinand established. The engine's in the back because Ferdinand proved it could work. The suspension is sophisticated because Ferdinand showed that complexity in the right places creates simplicity in the driving experience. When they developed the Taycan electric sports car, they were going back to 1900, to Ferdinand's first innovation. Electric motors can make brilliant sports cars if you engineer them properly. It took 120 years, but Porsche finally returned to where Ferdinand started. Then here's what's strange. Ferdinand Porsche probably would have hated the Taycan, not because it's electric, he pioneered electric cars, but because it weighs 5,100 pounds. He would have looked at that weight and said, "You learn nothing." The man who designed a sports car that weighed 1,350 pounds would be horrified that his company now builds 5,000-pound vehicles and calls them sports cars. He would have demanded they cut 2,000 pounds, and when engineers explained it was impossible, he would have shown them how. Because that was Ferdinand Porsche's real gift, showing people that their assumptions about what was possible were wrong. Not through inspiration or motivation, but through actual engineering, through building things that proved the impossible was just the possible that nobody had tried yet. The forgotten designs scattered through archives and museums aren't just interesting historical artifacts. They're proof that genius isn't about having all the answers. It's about asking questions nobody else is asking. Why does the engine have to be in front? It doesn't. Why can't a race car have four-wheel drive? It can. Why can't we build an affordable car with sophisticated engineering? We can. Why can't an electric car be a sports car? It absolutely can. Every question Porsche asked seemed obvious in retrospect, but someone had to ask them first, had to design the solutions, had to prove it could work, and then wait while the world caught up. There's probably a lesson there about innovation, about being too far ahead of your time, about the cost of genius. But maybe the real lesson is simpler. The best ideas are usually the ones that seem obvious once someone finally builds them. Ferdinand Porsche spent his entire career building obvious solutions to problems that nobody else had realized existed yet. And we're still finding his sketches, still discovering his forgotten prototypes, still learning that he solved problems decades before we knew we had them. The tragedy isn't that his designs were forgotten. The tragedy is how many of them are still forgotten, sitting in archives, waiting for someone to rediscover an innovation from 1935 that solves a problem from 2024. Because if history is any guide, somewhere in those archives is a Porsche design from 1947 that contains the solution to something we're struggling with right now. We just haven't found it yet. And that's the thing about Ferdinand Porsche that makes his story different from other automotive pioneers. Carl Benz invented the car, but his ideas stopped evolving. Gottlieb Daimler built better engines, but within known frameworks. Henry Ford revolutionized production, but not the product itself. Porsche kept revolutionizing. From 1900 to 1950, across 50 years, he never stopped questioning fundamental assumptions. Every decade brought new innovations, new radical ideas, new designs that seemed impossible. Most pioneers have one revolutionary idea. Porsche had dozens. And because he was working for other people, because he was a consultant designing for whoever would pay, his innovations got scattered across the industry. There's no single company that owns the Porsche legacy because he gave pieces of it to everyone. Steyr got advanced engines. NSU got rear-engine prototypes. Wanderer got innovative suspension designs. Auto Union got mid-engine race cars. Volkswagen got the people's car. Cisitalia got four-wheel drive. And all of them either cancelled the projects, went bankrupt, or got absorbed by larger companies. This is why Porsche's influence is so hard to trace. The innovations are everywhere, but they're credited to companies that no longer exist, or were renamed or merged. Ask who invented the modern sports car layout, and you'll get 10 different answers. The real answer is Ferdinand Porsche, multiple times, for multiple companies. Take the Tatra T77, a Czech car from 1934 that's often credited with pioneering aerodynamic design and rear-engine layout. Beautiful car, genuinely innovative. But Hans Ledwinka, who designed it, worked with Ferdinand Porsche in the 1920s, and they shared ideas constantly. There was actually a lawsuit after the war, because the Tatra looked suspiciously similar to the Volkswagen Beetle. Volkswagen settled for 3 million Deutschmarks, essentially admitting that Porsche and Ledwinka's collaboration had influenced both designs. Who innovated what? Nobody really knows anymore. This happened repeatedly. Engineers would work with Porsche, learn his methods, then go work for other companies and apply those lessons. The ideas spread like a virus through the German automotive industry, mutating and evolving, but always traceable back to Porsche's original innovations. By the 1950s, you could look at any advanced German car and find Porsche DNA. The Mercedes 300 SL, space-frame chassis evolved from Porsche's lightweight construction obsession. The BMW 507, independent suspension and weight distribution principles, Porsche pioneered. Even the Volkswagen Carmon Gia, that beautiful sports coupe built on Beetle mechanicals, was really just someone finally making the sports car that Porsche had wanted to build on that platform from the beginning. He'd sketched similar designs in the 1930S. But here's what's fascinating. While all these companies were building successful cars based on ideas, Porsche had originated. The actual Porsche company was struggling. The 356 was brilliant, but built in tiny numbers in a converted sawmill. They were literally hammering aluminum body panels by hand. Ferry Porsche and his small team were trying to build cars the way Ferdinand had always imagined. No compromises, perfect engineering, lightweight construction, sophisticated solutions. But they were competing against massive companies like Mercedes and BMW that had factories, resources, dealer networks. The 356 should have failed. A tiny company building expensive sports cars that looked weird and had the engine in the wrong place, competing against established luxury brands, every business consultant would have said it was impossible. But the 356 had something those other cars didn't. It was pure. It wasn't designed by committee or built to hit a price point or compromised to satisfy marketing departments. It was what Ferdinand Porsche had been trying to build his entire life, the perfect expression of his engineering philosophy. And people who drove it understood immediately. The 356 felt different. The balance, the handling, the way every component worked in harmony. You could feel that it had been designed by people who cared about nothing except making the perfect sports car. This is the other part of Ferdinand Porsche's forgotten legacy, proving that engineering purity has market value, that people will pay premium prices for products that are uncompromising, that you can build a successful business around perfectionism. Before Porsche, luxury cars competed on features, on size, on power, on prestige badges. The 356 competed on none of that. It was small, not particularly powerful, built by an unknown company. But it handled like a race car and was engineered like a Swiss watch. That created a completely new category, the driver's car, not the fastest, not the most luxurious, not the most practical. The car that felt best to drive, that rewarded skill, that made you better behind the wheel. Ferdinand Porsche had invented a new way to think about automobiles. And it worked because Ferdinand had spent 50 years learning what didn't matter. He built 300 horsepower supercharged monsters for Mercedes. They were impressive but not fulfilling. He designed the Beetle for maximum utility. It was successful but not exciting. The 356 distilled everything he'd learned into one essential truth. A great car is one where every element works in perfect harmony toward a single goal, and everything else is discarded. No excess, no compromise, no additions that don't serve the purpose. This philosophy became the foundation of every Porsche that followed. The 911 that replaced the 356 in 1964 was really just a refinement of the same principles. Rear engine, lightweight construction, perfect weight distribution, sophisticated engineering hidden under simple execution. People have been predicting the 911's death for 60 years. It's too expensive, too impractical. The rear engine layout is outdated. It should have been replaced with something more modern. And yet it keeps winning, keeps selling, keeps being the benchmark that other sports cars are measured against. Why? Because it's still executing Ferdinand Porsche's vision from 1931. That sketch of a rear-engine sports car wasn't just a design, it was a philosophy about what a sports car should be. And that philosophy was so fundamentally correct that it's still valid 93 years later. This is what separates forgotten designs that deserve to be forgotten from forgotten designs that were ahead of their time. Most innovations that fail because they're bad ideas, but Porsche's failures failed because the world wasn't ready yet. The 1900 hybrid electric car wasn't a bad idea. It was the right idea 110 years early. The NSU rear-engine prototype wasn't wrong. It just couldn't be profitable in 1933. The Cisitalia four-wheel drive race car wasn't impractical. Racing just wasn't ready for it yet. And this creates a strange situation for automotive historians. How do you credit innovations? Do you credit the person who had the idea first, or the person who made it successful? Because if you credit first, Ferdinand Porsche invented almost everything. If you credit success, his name barely appears. Take four-wheel drive in performance cars. The Audi Quattro gets all the credit for proving it works in the 1980S. But Ferdinand Porsche designed a four-wheel drive race car in 1947, and he'd sketched four-wheel drive concepts as early as 1932. The Cisitalia never raced, so Porsche doesn't get credit, but Audi engineers, when developing the Quattro, studied that Cisitalia design. They learned from Porsche's solutions to weight distribution, power delivery, mechanical complexity. The Quattro succeeded partly because Porsche had already solved the hard problems. This pattern repeats endlessly. Turbocharging in race cars. Porsche designed turbocharged engines in the 1960s for Can-Am racing. The Porsche 91730 produced over 1,500 horsepower from a turbocharged flat 12. It was so dominant, the series changed rules to ban it. When BMW wanted to build the first turbocharged Formula One engine in the 1980s, their engineers studied the 91730. When every manufacturer adopted turbocharging in F1, they were following paths Porsche had mapped decades earlier. But the history books credit BMW for innovation. Or take carbon fiber monocoques in road cars. The McLaren F1 from 1992 is usually credited as the first. But Porsche built a carbon fiber chassis for the 959 rally car in the MID-1980S. And they'd been experimenting with advanced composite materials since the 1960s for race cars. The 959 itself is a perfect example of how Porsche's innovation gets forgotten. It was the most advanced car in the world when it launched in 1986. Sequential twin turbocharging, four-wheel drive with torque vectoring, tire pressure monitoring, adjustable ride height, hollow-spoke magnesium wheels. Technologies that are standard on every performance car today. The 959 had them 40 years ago. But most people remember the Ferrari F40 from the same era, not the Porsche 959. The Ferrari was simpler, more emotional, more dramatic. The Porsche was just quietly years ahead. This is Ferdinand Porsche's legacy in miniature. Be so far ahead that by the time everyone catches up, they've forgotten you were first. build things so sophisticated that their innovation only becomes obvious in retrospect. And nowhere is this more evident than in the forgotten projects that never made it past the prototype phase. In the Porsche Museum basement, there are cars that nobody outside the company has seen, designs that were tested and abandoned, innovations that were too expensive or too complex or just too early. There's a MID-1970S prototype for a four-seat Porsche with the engine in the front, the car that eventually became the 928. But the early prototypes also included designs for a smaller, lighter version with a flat six that would have been positioned between the 911 and the 924. That car never got built because Porsche couldn't afford to produce 3 sports car lines simultaneously. But the design philosophy, a front-engine Porsche that still felt like a Porsche, influenced the Boxster and Cayman decades later, another idea that had to wait for its time. Or the 1980s, Porsche 965, a twin turbocharged all-wheel drive version of the 911 that would have produced over 400 horsepower. It was tested, developed, almost put into production, then cancelled because Porsche feared it would cannibalize 959 sales. 20 years later, Porsche built exactly that car, the 911 Turbo with all-wheel drive. It became one of their most successful models. The 965 wasn't wrong, it was just early. Again. This happened so often that Porsche engineers developed a dark joke. We don't cancel projects, we just postpone them for 20 years. And it's eerily accurate. Ideas rejected in the 1970s became products in the 1990S. Designs from the 1990s are being reconsidered now. But here's what makes this different from other companies' forgotten designs. Porsche's cancelled projects weren't failures of imagination or engineering. They were usually too successful, too advanced, too perfectly executed for the market conditions of their time. The 965 all-wheel drive 911 would have worked perfectly in 1987. The engineering was sound, but Porsche was selling every 959 they could build at 3 times the 965's planned price. Why introduce a cheaper competitor to your most exclusive car? So the project got shelved, the prototypes were hidden away, and Porsche waited until the market could support both cars. Then they built it, and it worked exactly as the 1980s prototypes had promised: patient innovation. This patience came from watching Ferdinand Porsche spend 50 years being too early. The company learned that being first doesn't matter if the timing is wrong. Better to wait until the market is ready than to waste a brilliant idea on indifferent customers. It's a completely different philosophy from most automotive companies, who rush to be first to market with new features. Porsche waits until they can do it perfectly, even if that means being second or third. They learned from Ferdinand that perfect execution beats early introduction. But there's a cost to this approach. How many brilliant ideas died in those museum basements? How many innovations were postponed so long that other companies eventually developed them independently? How much did Porsche lose by being too patient? We can't know, but we do know that the ideas that did eventually make it to production were executed flawlessly. The 959's four-wheel drive system worked perfectly because Porsche had been refining the concept since 1947. The Taycan's electric drivetrain works brilliantly because they've been studying electric motors since 1900. This is Ferdinand Porsche's other gift to the company that bears his name: the understanding that some ideas need time to mature, that it's okay to be patient with innovation, that forgotten doesn't mean failed, it might just mean not yet. And that's why the archives and museum basements are so important. They're not graveyards of failed ideas. They're libraries of solutions waiting for problems that haven't emerged yet. Every Porsche engineer knows that somewhere in those files might be the answer to whatever challenge they're facing today. Ferdinand Porsche died in 1951, but his design philosophy never did. It just kept evolving, kept being refined, kept proving that the fundamental principles he established were timeless. Weight distribution matters. Simplicity is sophisticated. Compromise nothing. And those 3 principles, weight distribution, simplicity, no compromise, sound obvious when you say them, but actually executing them requires saying no to almost everything. No to adding features customers request. No to making the car more comfortable if it adds weight. No to easier solutions that compromise the core philosophy. This is why Porsche has always been a small company compared to Mercedes or BMW. They can't build millions of cars because building millions requires compromises. You need to design for different markets, different price points, different customer preferences. You need to be flexible. Ferdinand Porsche's philosophy is the opposite of flexible. It's rigid, uncompromising, almost obsessive. And that only works if you're willing to stay small, to serve a narrow slice of customers who value what you're doing enough to pay premium prices. But here's the twist. That rigidity created freedom. Because Porsche wasn't trying to please everyone. They could ignore trends, ignore focus groups, ignore what competitors were doing. They could just ask, what would Ferdinand do? And the answer was usually something impossible. Ferdinand would make it lighter. Ferdinand would move the weight lower. Ferdinand would remove the thing everyone thinks is essential. Ferdinand would prove that the conventional wisdom is wrong. This became a competitive advantage that nobody else could copy. Mercedes could hire great engineers. BMW could invest in advanced technology. But they couldn't make their engineers think like Ferdinand Porsche, because thinking like Ferdinand Porsche requires ignoring everything that makes business sense. Take the decision to keep the 911's engine in the rear. Every automotive engineer knows that mid-engine is superior for a sports car. Better weight distribution, better handling, easier to package. Porsche's own engineers designed mid-engine cars like the Boxster and Cayman that prove the point. But the 911 keeps its rear engine layout, this supposedly inferior configuration, and keeps being faster around racetracks than mid-engine competitors. How? Because Porsche has spent 60 years refining a layout that everyone else abandoned as obsolete. They've developed suspension geometries, electronic controls, weight distribution strategies that make rear engine work better than mid-engine in practice, even though mid-engine is theoretically superior. They've turned a disadvantage into an advantage through sheer engineering obsession. This is pure Ferdinand Porsche. Take the thing everyone says is wrong, prove it can work, then engineer it to perfection while competitors waste time on better solutions. The 1900 hybrid was wrong for its time. The mid-engine race car was too difficult. The rear-engine sports car defied physics. And all of them worked, eventually, after enough refinement. Because Porsche understood that theoretical perfection means nothing if you can't execute it. A worse idea executed brilliantly beats a better idea executed adequately. This shows up in the most unexpected places. In the 1990s, every supercar was chasing horsepower numbers. Ferrari, Lamborghini, McLaren. Everyone was building 600, 700, 800 horsepower monsters. And Porsche built the 911 GT3 with only 360 horsepower. Journalists mocked it. How could a 360 horsepower car compete with 600 horsepower supercars? It couldn't, on paper, but the GT3 weighed 1,350 kilograms, had perfect weight distribution, and could lap the Nürburgring faster than cars with twice the power. Ferdinand Porsche would have loved the GT3. It's everything he believed in: lightweight over raw power, balance over brute force, engineering elegance over impressive specifications. It's a 1920s Sasha or 1930s Auto Union, just built with modern materials. And it created a whole new category of performance cars. The lightweight, naturally aspirated, handling-focused sports car that prioritizes driver engagement over straight-line speed. Now every manufacturer builds them. BMW M4 GTS, Ferrari 458 Speciale, Lamborghini Gallardo Superleggera. But Porsche built the first modern one, and they built it because they were still following design principles from a man who died in 1951. That's how long good ideas last when they're actually good. There's a specific example that perfectly illustrates this. In 2015, Porsche built a 911 called the R, a lightweight special edition limited to 991 units. They removed the rear seats, used thinner glass, deleted the air conditioning and radio, fitted lightweight wheels. The result weighed 1,370 kilograms, and journalists wrote articles like, "Porsche proves less is more," as if this was a revelation, a new philosophy, as if Ferdinand Porsche hadn't been saying exactly this for 75 years before anyone was listening. The 911R was just Porsche finally building the car. Ferdinand had always wanted to build. No excess, no compromise, nothing that doesn't make it faster or better to drive. It took them 65 years after his death to have the confidence to actually do it. And people paid $300,000 for a car with no air conditioning, no radio, no rear seats, because they understood what Porsche had finally proven. Ferdinand was right. Weight is the enemy. Simplicity is sophisticated. Compromise nothing. But here's what's sad about this. Ferdinand Porsche never got to see any of this vindication. He died before the 356 became successful, before the 911 existed, decades before his design philosophy became the foundation of an entire automotive culture. He died thinking most of his innovations had failed. The hybrid electric car that nobody wanted, the NSU prototypes that got cancelled, the Cisitalia race car that never raced, the people's car that became a symbol of Nazi Germany. So many brilliant ideas that seemed to go nowhere. His son Ferry tried to convince him that the 356 was the beginning of something important, that the company they'd started in that Austrian workshop might actually survive. But Ferdinand was old, sick, and bitter about a lifetime of watching other people take credit for his innovations. In his last days, Ferdinand reportedly told Ferry, "I looked for the car and could not find it anywhere, so I built it myself." That was his legacy. Not fame or recognition, but knowing he'd built the cars he wanted to build, the way he wanted to build them. Ferry later said that sentence defined everything Porsche became. They don't build cars to meet market demands or follow trends. They build the cars they want to drive, the cars they can't find anywhere else. And if customers want them too, wonderful. This is a completely insane way to run a car company. Market research exists for a reason. Focus groups matter. Understanding customer preferences is basic business sense. Ignoring all of that and just building what engineers want should result in bankruptcy. But it worked for Porsche because Ferdinand's vision was so clear, so pure, so fundamentally correct that the cars he wanted to build turned out to be the cars a specific type of customer desperately wanted too. Not everyone, not most people, but enough people willing to pay enough money. And here's what's fascinating. The people who buy Porsches usually aren't buying them because they're the fastest or the most luxurious or the most practical. They're buying them because they recognize and value the engineering philosophy behind them. The Porsche customer is someone who understands why removing the radio makes the car better, why spending $5,000 on lightweight wheels is worth it, why rear-engine layout creates a unique driving experience. They're buying into Ferdinand Porsche's worldview. This created one of the most valuable things a company can have. Customers who understand what you're trying to do and want you to keep doing it. Customers who get angry if you compromise, who demand that you stay true to the philosophy even when it's expensive or difficult. When Porsche built the Cayenne SUV in 2002, purists revolted. An SUV? Porsche building an SUV was betraying everything Ferdinand stood for. Except Ferdinand spent most of his career designing military vehicles, tractors, and practical transportation. He wasn't a sports car purist. The Cayenne used the same philosophy Ferdinand always applied. Engineer it properly. Don't compromise on quality. Make it the best version of what it's supposed to be. And it became the best handling SUV in the world, saved Porsche from bankruptcy, and funded development of better sports cars. Ferdinand would have understood that perfectly. He designed the Beetle to fund auto union race cars. He took consulting work to pay for the projects he actually cared about. Practical vehicles, finance, passionate engineering. It's the same model. But the purists' reaction shows something important. Ferdinand Porsche's legacy isn't just about engineering. It's about identity, about belonging to a tribe that values certain principles over others. Porsche isn't selling cars, they're selling membership in Ferdinand's philosophy. And that philosophy has spread far beyond Porsche, the company. It infected the entire automotive enthusiast culture. The obsession with weight reduction, with perfect weight distribution, with sophisticated simplicity. That's all Ferdinand Porsche's influence. When some teenager modifies their Honda Civic by removing the rear seats and sound deadening to save weight, they're following Porsche's principles without knowing it. When track day enthusiasts debate the perfect suspension geometry, they're continuing arguments Ferdinand was having in 1930. The entire culture of automotive enthusiasm, caring about how cars feel rather than just what they do, valuing engineering elegance, obsessing over details that don't matter to normal people, traces directly back to Ferdinand Porsche, proving that these things actually matter. Before Porsche, cars were judged on objective metrics: how fast, how powerful, how big. After Porsche, there was this other dimension: how does it feel? How well is it engineered? Does it reward skill? And once that dimension existed, it couldn't be ignored. Mercedes had to make the AMG models feel special, not just go fast. BMW had to prove their cars were ultimate driving machines, not just luxury sedans. Audi had to demonstrate engineering sophistication. The entire German automotive industry's obsession with engineering excellence, with building cars that are over-engineered and sophisticated in ways customers can't always articulate, that's Ferdinand Porsche's ghost haunting every boardroom. But there's a darker side to this legacy too. The obsession with engineering perfection, with proving German superiority, with building machines that demonstrate technical dominance. We've already discussed how that got weaponized by the Nazis. And it didn't end with World War II. The Cold War made German engineering a political statement again. West Germany needed to prove capitalism produced better results than East Germany's communism. Cars became ambassadors, proof that the Western system worked. Porsche 911s, Mercedes S-Classes, BMW 7 Series. These weren't just luxury cars. They were evidence that West Germany was prosperous, advanced, superior. Every export was a small propaganda victory, and the engineering obsession served that purpose perfectly. Today, that political dimension has mostly faded, but the engineering culture remains. German car companies still engineer their vehicles to standards that seem excessive, that can't be justified purely by market demands. Because it's not about the market, it's about identity. Being German, building German cars, means engineering them properly, means refusing to cut corners, means obsessing over details. It's not pragmatic, it's cultural, and it comes directly from Ferdinand Porsche, proving that engineering obsession could create value. But we're living through a moment where that entire culture is being challenged. Electric vehicles don't need the precision machining, the perfect tolerances, the sophisticated mechanical engineering that German companies excel at. An electric motor is simple. A battery pack is simple. The software matters more than the hardware. And German companies, with their culture of mechanical perfection, are struggling to adapt to a world where mechanical perfection matters less. This is the same challenge Ferdinand Porsche faced in 1900 with his hybrid electric car. The world wasn't ready for it then. Now the world is ready. Maybe too ready, and German companies are scrambling to catch up to technology their own grandfather of engineering pioneered 125 years ago. There's something poetic about that. The industry is circling back to where Ferdinand started, proving he was right all along. But the companies built on his legacy are the ones struggling most with the transition. They're so good at internal combustion that electric feels like a step backward. Porsche's Taycan is the best example of this tension. It's an exceptional car, brilliantly engineered, faster than almost anything else. But it weighs 2,300 kilograms. Ferdinand Porsche, who built sports cars weighing 1,350 kilograms, would consider that an abomination. And Porsche engineers know this. They know Ferdinand would demand they cut 800 kilograms from the Taycan. But with current battery technology, they can't. The physics doesn't work. So they're stuck building cars that violate their own principles. This is the existential crisis facing every company influenced by Ferdinand Porsche's legacy. How do you maintain engineering philosophy when the technology changes? Are the principles timeless or were they specific to internal combustion? The answer probably determines which German companies survive the next 20 years. Because if the principles are timeless, weight distribution matters, simplicity is sophisticated, compromise nothing, then they just need to apply them to new technology. But if the principles were tied to mechanical engineering, if Ferdinand's genius was specifically about perfecting internal combustion, then they're about to become obsolete, just like all those forgotten designs from the 1930s. Porsche is betting everything on the first interpretation. The Taycan may weigh 2,300 kilograms, but it has perfect weight distribution. The engineering is sophisticated but hidden, creating simplicity in the driving experience. And they compromised nothing. It's expensive, impractical, and unashamedly focused on performance. That's still Ferdinand Porsche's philosophy, just applied to electric motors instead of flat sixes. And if they're right, if the principles really are timeless, then all those forgotten designs in the archives might suddenly become relevant again. Because electric vehicles change what's possible. Individual wheel loaders? That's the 1900 Lohner-Porsche. Four-wheel drive with torque vectoring? That's the 1947 Cisitalia? Instant torque and smooth power delivery? Ferdinand understood that in his first electric car? All the innovations that were too complex, too expensive, too difficult to execute with mechanical drivetrains become simple with electric motors. The forgotten designs weren't wrong, they were just waiting for technology to catch up. And this brings us full circle to the real lesson of Ferdinand Porsche's forgotten designs. Innovation isn't linear. Progress doesn't flow smoothly from past to future. Sometimes the best ideas have to wait decades for the world to be ready. Sometimes you have to go backward to go forward. The automotive industry spent 120 years perfecting internal combustion, getting further and further from Ferdinand's 1900 electric hybrid. And now we're returning to it, discovering that his original instinct was correct. We took a century-long detour. How many other detours are we on? How many of Ferdinand's forgotten designs are sitting in archives, waiting for someone to rediscover an innovation from 1935 that solves a problem from 2025? That's the question haunting every German automaker right now. Because if history is any guide, the solutions they need probably already exist. They just need to remember what they've forgotten. Porsche, the company, has an advantage here that Mercedes and BMW don't. They have direct access to Ferdinand's archives, his sketches, his prototypes. Every time they face a new challenge, they can ask, did Ferdinand already solve this? And frighteningly often, the answer is yes. The principles are there, waiting to be rediscovered, adapted, applied to new technology. Weight distribution, simplicity, hidden behind sophistication, refusing to compromise. This is Ferdinand Porsche's ultimate legacy, not specific cars or technologies, but a way of thinking about problems that remains valid regardless of what's being engineered. A philosophy that works whether you're building hybrid electrics in 1900 or 2025. Then maybe that's the real tragedy of his forgotten designs. Not that they were forgotten, but that we keep forgetting the same lessons. Every generation has to rediscover that weight matters, that simplicity is sophisticated, that compromise destroys excellence. Ferdinand spent 50 years teaching those lessons. His cars proved them over and over. And still, most of the automotive industry ignores them, chases horsepower numbers and feature lists and mass market appeal. But there's always been a small group who understood. Engineers who studied his designs, customers who bought his cars, enthusiasts who recognized that something different was happening here, and they kept the philosophy alive. Today, when you see a stripped-out track car with the radio removed and the rear seats gone, that's Ferdinand Porsche's influence. When you see someone choosing the lighter wheel option even though it costs thousands more, that's his legacy. When you hear engineers arguing about weight distribution at a barbecue, that's his ghost. He didn't just create cars. He created a culture, a way of thinking about automobiles that infected everyone who understood what he was doing. And that culture spread far beyond Germany, far beyond Porsche, far beyond anything he could have imagined. There are garage builders in Japan modifying Toyotas using Porsche principles. There are American hot rodders who've never seen a Porsche applying his weight reduction philosophy. There are Chinese EV startups studying his 1900 hybrid to understand how to package electric drivetrains. Ferdinand Porsche's ideas escaped, spread globally, became fundamental to how anyone who cares about cars thinks about engineering, and most of them don't even know where those ideas came from. That's both the triumph and the tragedy. The triumph is that his philosophy won, became universal, shaped the entire world of automotive enthusiasm. The tragedy is that his name isn't attached to most of it. But maybe Ferdinand wouldn't have cared about the credit. His last words were about building the car he couldn't find anywhere else. Not about recognition, not about legacy, just about solving problems through engineering. And in the end, that's what all those forgotten designs represent. A lifetime of solving problems, of seeing what didn't exist and making it real, of refusing to accept that anything was impossible. Some of those solutions found homes immediately. Some took decades to be appreciated. Some are still waiting in archives for someone to recognize their value. But all of them were brilliant. All of them worked. All of them pushed the boundaries of what was possible. Ferdinand Porsche died in 1951, frustrated that so many of his ideas had been rejected, buried, or credited to others. He never knew that his forgotten designs would eventually be recognized as the foundation of modern automotive engineering. He never knew that the company his son built from those rejected ideas would become the most profitable car manufacturer in the world. He never knew that his name would become synonymous with engineering excellence. But somewhere in those Austrian mountains where he's buried, maybe Ferdinand Porsche would have appreciated the irony. The man who spent his life being too early finally has everyone catching up to where he was a century ago. His forgotten designs aren't forgotten anymore. They're the future we're finally ready to build. And every time someone strips weight from a car, perfects a weight distribution, or refuses to compromise on engineering excellence, they're continuing his work. The hybrid electric car from 1900, the rear-engine sports car from 1931, the mid-engine race car from 1934, the four-wheel drive supercar from 1947. None of them were forgotten. They were just waiting for us to catch up. And we're still catching up. Somewhere in those archives, there's probably a Ferdinand Porsche design from 1938 that contains the solution to a problem we haven't even identified yet, because that's how far ahead he was. The forgotten designs that changed the car industry weren't forgotten at all. They were just ideas from the future, temporarily stored in the past, waiting for the world to be ready.